What if the chaos in the Middle East, the wars, the borders that make no sense, the oil politics, the endless instability, what if none of it was an accident? What if I told you there's a receipt? Not a metaphorical receipt, an actual documented financial paper trail that shows exactly how European bankers bought an empire piece by piece, then carved it up like a foreclosed property. You've been taught that the Ottoman Empire collapsed because it was backward, because it couldn't modernize, because history simply moved on. That's the version they want you to believe. The truth is uglier. The truth involves compound interest, manufactured crises, and a debt trap so perfectly designed that it makes modern predatory lending look amateur. Here's what they don't teach you. By 1881, foreign bankers controlled more of the Ottoman Empire's revenue than the Sultan himself. European financiers had their hands directly in the Ottoman treasury, skimming taxes before the government could even touch them. This wasn't conquest by army. This was conquest by spreadsheet. And the playbook they wrote? It's still running today. Different names, same game. Before we dive in, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I want to know how far this reaches. And if you're tired of the sanitized version of history, hit subscribe. This channel is about the unfiltered truth, the receipts they hoped you'd never find. Now, let's start with what you think you know. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 600 years. At its peak, it controlled southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and northern Africa. 3 continents, millions of square miles. It was the gunpowder empire that made Europe tremble. By the 1850s, it was being called the sick man of Europe. What happened? The conventional story goes like this. The Ottomans fell behind during the Industrial Revolution. They couldn't modernize fast enough. Their military weakened. Their administration became corrupt. Eventually, they picked the wrong side in World War I, and that was the end. It's a neat story. It's also missing the most important chapter. Let's talk about the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. The Ottoman Empire went to war alongside Britain and France against Russia. Now, here's the first parallel that should make your ears perk up. The Ottomans didn't have the cash to fight this war. So what did they do? They borrowed. Sound familiar? In 1854, the Ottoman Empire took its first foreign loan. Before this moment, the empire had never borrowed from European markets. For centuries, they had managed without it. The loan was for 3 million British pounds. The terms? The Ottomans had to repay 3.3 million. But here's where the trap begins. They only actually received about 2.5 million after fees, commissions, and placement costs were deducted by the bankers. Let me say that again. They borrowed 3 million. They had to pay back 3.3 million. They only received 2.5 million. On day one, they were underwater. The lenders, British banks primarily. The Rothschild banking network was involved. So was the Ottoman Bank, which despite its name was controlled by British and French capital. This first loan was supposedly to fund the war. But here's what the textbooks skip. Once you take the first loan, you've entered a system designed to ensure you take the second, and the third, and the fourth. The Ottomans won the Crimean War, by the way. They were on the winning side, but they came out of victory drowning in debt. Does that sound familiar? How many countries have you watched win a war and lose a generation to paying for it? By 1875, just 2 decades after that first loan, the Ottoman Empire had borrowed approximately 200 million British pounds. At the time, that was an almost incomprehensible sum. Adjusted for today's purchasing power, we're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars. And here's the part that should make your blood pressure rise. Most of that money never built anything. It didn't industrialize the empire. It didn't modernize the military in any lasting way. It went to paying interest on previous loans. The Ottomans were borrowing money to pay interest on the money they had already borrowed. A debt spiral, a snake eating its own tail. Sound familiar? How many countries right now are issuing new bonds just to service existing debt? How many of us have credit cards that work exactly the same way? Minimum payments that barely touch the principal while interest compounds. This isn't ancient history. This is the template. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire did something that sent shockwaves through European financial markets. They defaulted. The Sultan announced that the empire could only pay half of its scheduled interest payments. Now, in a just world, this would have meant the lenders took a loss, they made risky loans at high interest rates, the borrower couldn't pay. That's the risk you accept when you charge predatory rates. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was one of history's greatest power grabs disguised as financial restructuring. European creditors didn't accept the loss. They demanded control. In 1881, after years of negotiation conducted under the threat of military intervention, the Ottoman Empire was forced to accept something unprecedented. The decree of Muharrem established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Let me explain what this was, because this is where the conspiracy becomes undeniable. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was a foreign-run institution, headquartered in Istanbul but controlled by a council representing European bondholders, British representatives, French representatives, German, Austrian, Italian, all sitting in the Ottoman capital with legal authority to collect Ottoman taxes directly. Not to advise on taxes, not to audit, to collect. The OPDA took control of the empire's most reliable revenue streams: salt taxes, silk taxes, tobacco taxes, stamp duties, fishing rights, the tribute payments from vassal states. These revenues went directly to European creditors before the Ottoman government saw a single coin. By 1911, the OPDA controlled approximately 1/3 of the entire Ottoman imperial revenue, 1/3 taken at the source. And here's the detail that should haunt you. The OPDA employed more people than most Ottoman government ministries. At its peak, it had over 8,000 employees, tax collectors, administrators, accountants, all working on Ottoman soil, collecting Ottoman money, sending it to European banks. The Sultan still sat on his throne, the Ottoman flag still flew. But sovereignty had been repossessed. This was colonization without an invasion. This was empire by contract law. And the men who designed this system, they knew exactly what they were doing. They wrote it down. The loan documents are in archives. The terms are readable. The intent is clear. Lend to a weakened state. Charge rates it cannot sustain. Wait for default. Use default as justification to seize control of revenue. Extract wealth indefinitely. This playbook didn't die with the Ottoman Empire. It evolved. But before I show you exactly how it evolved, before I show you the direct line from 1881 Istanbul to the IMF structural adjustment programs that gutted Latin America and Africa in the 1980s and 1990s, there's a name you need to know, a specific decision, a specific moment when the trap snapped shut, and you won't believe who was sitting at the table when it happened. Let's talk about how this actually worked, because the devil is genuinely in the details, and the details are damning. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration wasn't just a collection agency. It was a parallel government. Understanding its mechanics reveals the blueprint for every debt trap that followed. First, the interest rates. Ottoman bonds in the 1860s and 1870s carried interest rates between 5 and 12%. Now, that might not sound outrageous compared to modern credit cards, but remember the context. These were sovereign loans to an empire. Today, stable governments borrow at rates between 2 and 5%. Anything above that signals risk. But here's the trick. The loans were issued at a discount. A £100 bond might sell for £60. The Ottomans received 60. They owed 100. The interest was calculated on 100. So your effective interest rate, it wasn't 6%. It was closer to 15 or 20% when you account for the discount. The bankers knew the Ottomans couldn't service this. They were counting on it. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman Empire borrowed approximately £238 million nominal value. After discounts and banker commissions, they received roughly £127 million, about 53% of the face value. They owed double what they received from the beginning. Now let's talk about what the money was actually used for, because this is where the narrative of Ottoman backwardness falls apart completely. A significant portion of these loans went to military modernization, purchasing weapons and ships from British and French manufacturers. The bankers loaned money that immediately flowed back to European factories. Another portion went to infrastructure projects, often contracted to European firms. The Ottomans borrowed money, paid European companies to build railroads, and then owed interest on the privilege. Do you see the loop? The loans didn't develop the Ottoman economy. They developed European exports. The Ottomans got the debt. Europe got the contracts and the interest. This is what economists today call odious debt. Debt that doesn't benefit the borrowing population but must still be repaid by them. And the OPDA institutionalized this extraction permanently. Here are the numbers that should make you understand the scale. By 1912, the Ottoman Empire's total debt had reached approximately 168 million Turkish lira. Annual debt service, just the interest payments, consumed over 30% of total government revenue. 30%. Before the government could spend on roads, schools, military, or administration, nearly a third vanished into European banks. Compare that to today. The United States currently spends roughly 13% of federal revenue on interest payments, and economists are sounding alarms. The Ottoman Empire was at 30%, and it stayed there for decades. How do you modernize an empire when a third of everything you collect is already claimed? You don't. That's the point. The OPDA didn't want Ottoman modernization. A modernized Ottoman Empire might have become a competitor. A debtor state kept weak was a captured market and a guaranteed revenue stream. Let me introduce you to the man who perfected the system. His name was Sir Edgar Vincent. Vincent was a British financier who served as the director of the Imperial Ottoman Bank and played a central role in the OPDA's expansion. He later became Viscount d'Abernon, a title earned largely through his work extracting wealth from Ottoman territory. Vincent understood something crucial. The OPDA's real power wasn't just collection, it was information. The OPDA knew Ottoman revenues better than the Ottoman government did. It had agents in every province. It tracked every tax stream. This information asymmetry meant the OPDA could predict Ottoman financial crises before the Sultan's own ministers. And they used this advantage. When the Ottomans needed emergency funds for wars, for natural disasters, for any crisis, they had to borrow again from the same banks, with the same terms. Because the OPDA controlled the revenue that would have provided alternatives. This is what economists call a debt trap, but trap is too passive a word. This was engineered dependency. Let's trace the consequences forward. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The new government wanted modernization. They wanted to break free of European financial control. They couldn't. The OPDA was legally untouchable. The debt agreements had been written into international treaties. Breaking them would have meant war. So the Young Turks did what desperate governments do. They tried to find new lenders. Germany was rising. German banks offered loans with slightly better terms. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway was the centerpiece, a German finance project that would give the Ottoman Empire a new economic lifeline. Britain saw this and panicked, not because of military threat, but because of financial threat. If German capital replaced British capital in the Ottoman Empire, British banking interests would lose their extraction rights. This is the dirty secret of World War I that economic historians whisper about. The financial partition of the Ottoman Empire was already being negotiated before the first shot was fired. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the secret deal between Britain and France to carve up Ottoman territory, wasn't just about land. It was about debt. When you read the agreement, you see it. The territories were divided not just by geographic logic, but by economic assets. Who gets the oil? Who gets the ports? Who controls the trade routes? The OPDA's maps of Ottoman revenue streams essentially became the template for post-war borders. Let me hit you with dates that matter. 1881, OPDA established. European control of Ottoman finances formalized. 1903, British banks control over 60% of Ottoman foreign debt. 1908, Young Turk Revolution fails to break financial dependency. 1914, World War I begins. Ottoman debt exceeds 160 million lira. 1918, Ottoman Empire defeated. The Treaty of Sèvres begins dismemberment. 1923, Treaty of Lausanne creates modern Turkey. The new republic inherits 62% of Ottoman debt, approximately 107 million gold lira. Read that last point again. Turkey didn't escape the debt. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, spent the early years of the republic negotiating debt repayment. The Republic of Turkey made its final Ottoman debt payment in 1954. 31 years after the empire officially ended, the debt outlived the debtor, and the lands that didn't become Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Arabia, they were distributed among creditor powers as mandates. Britain and France didn't colonize these lands in the traditional sense. They administered them. They administered them the way a bank administers a foreclosed property. Oil was discovered in Iraq in 1927. The Iraq Petroleum Company was controlled by British, French, and American interests. The Iraqi people lived above the oil. They didn't own it. This pattern repeated across the region. Resources extracted by foreign companies, profits repatriated to European capitals, local populations left with environmental damage and political instability. The borders drawn by Sykes-Picot intentionally divided ethnic and religious groups across multiple states. The Kurds were split between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Sunni and Shia populations were combined in ways that guaranteed tension. Why would the mapmakers do this? Because divided populations are easier to control. Because a region in perpetual low-level conflict never unifies against its creditors. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented policy. The British Foreign Office archives contain memos discussing exactly this logic. Now let me show you how the playbook survived. After World War II, Europe was shattered. The old colonial powers couldn't maintain direct control, so they evolved the system. The International Monetary Fund was created in 1944. The World Bank soon followed. These institutions were presented as benevolent, global lenders of last resort, helping struggling nations develop. The terms looked different. The names were different. But the mechanism? Identical. Country in crisis needs funds. IMF provides emergency loans. The conditions? Structural adjustment, cut social spending, privatize national assets, open markets to foreign investment, accept foreign advisors in your treasury. Does this sound like the OPDA? It should. In the 1980s, Latin America drowned in debt. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, they all went through structural adjustment. Foreign experts sat in their finance ministries. Revenue streams were directed to creditors before domestic needs. Africa fared even worse. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire borrowed billions. The money vanished into personal accounts. The Congolese people were held responsible for the debt. Jamaica borrowed from the IMF in the 1970s. By the 1990s, the country was spending more on debt service than on health and education combined. Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio approached 150%. Greece in 2010. The Troika, IMF, European Central Bank, European Commission imposed austerity measures that crashed the Greek economy by 25%. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. The medicine was worse than the disease. And the debt, it kept growing. These aren't coincidences. These aren't accidents. This is the OPDA model, refined, globalized, made permanent. The Ottoman Empire was the test case, the proof of concept. And now I need to tell you about the receipts from the architects themselves, the documents that prove this was always the plan. The receipt is wilder than you think. Thank you. See you in next video.